Hello and welcome to Bees Chem. My name is Mrs. Bees and I make these videos as study material for my students outside the classroom. If there's anything you'd like to see in the future, please leave a comment below and I'm happy to add it to my list. Let's get started. I made this video to go over the main memorization tips I use in class for diatomic elements, polyatomic ions, and strong acids and bases. I strongly recommend memorizing these before the start of AP Chemistry as they will save you time throughout the units. Let's start with diatomic elements. So there are 7 elements on the periodic table that form diatomic molecules, which means that they are 2 atoms bonded together. So let's do a quick example of how we would see that in a chemical reaction. So let's say you were told that magnesium and oxygen formed magnesium oxide. So that would be a synthesis reaction. We have magnesium. Magnesium is not a diatomic element, so there are only one of those atoms. It is a solid. And then we know that it's going to react with oxygen. Now, oxygen is one of the diatomic elements, so when it exists by itself, it's going to exist as 2 atoms bonded together. And oxygen is a gas. And then when it forms magnesium oxide, which is a solid, there's going to be 1 magnesium and 1 oxygen because magnesium has a positive 2 charge. Oxygen has a negative 2 charge, so they cancel each other out. So then from here, we would have to balance the chemical equation. Since there are 2 oxygens on the left, we would have to put a 2 in front of magnesium oxide and then a 2 in front of magnesium. So this is just a very simple example of where you can see a diatomic element in a chemical reaction. Now, there are 2 ways to memorize the 7 diatomic elements. The first one I'm going to share with you is something that I personally learned in college. And that is have no fear of ice cold beer. So have no fear of ice cold beer is going to correspond to the 7 elements on the periodic table, which are hydrogen, nitrogen, fluorine, oxygen, iodine, chlorine, and bromine. However, what students kind of got confused on when I was teaching this my first couple years of teaching chemistry is that chlorine and cold, kids kind of went towards carbon, and then bromine and beer, kids kind of went towards boron. So there was kind of a margin of error that I wasn't expecting. So if you want to memorize it this way and just remember that C corresponds to chlorine and B corresponds to bromine, that is totally fine, but I have found a better way to memorize. And that is using the periodic table. So the 7 diatomic elements make a 7 on the periodic table. So I went ahead and highlighted the 7 diatomic elements so you can see them on the periodic table. You can see that 6 of them make a 7 on the right-hand side, and then you have hydrogen on the left that's also a diatomic element. Now we're going to move into polyatomic ions. So a polyatomic ion is a covalent bonded set of 2 or more atoms that can be considered to behave as a single unit and have a net charge that is not 0. So students can perform pretty well on the AP Chemistry exam without fully memorizing the polyatomic ions. However, knowing them will help with strong acids and bases, formula writing, electrochemistry, and even more than that. So a quick way to memorize the significant amount of polyatomic ions is using the Nick the Camel method. So this is a somewhat abstract way of memorizing the polyatomic ions. If you want to just memorize them outright, that is totally fine. This is just another tool because since it is abstract, kids tend to memorize it a little bit easier. So the first step in this technique is actually memorizing this sentence at the top here. Nick the Camel ate clam supper in Phoenix with Brad. And it's important to know that Nick, Camel, Clam, Supper, Phoenix, and Brad are all capitalized. Those are going to be your polyatomic ions. The first step is going to be identifying the first element in the polyatomic ion. So in Nick we have nitrogen, Camel we have carbon, Clam is chlorine, Supper is sulfur, Phoenix is phosphorus, and Brad is bromine. Then we're going to look at the number of consonants in each word to tell us how many oxygen atoms are in that polyatomic ion. For example, in Nick, we know the first element is going to be nitrogen, and then it has 3 consonants, so it's going to have 3 oxygens. And then finally, we're going to look at the number of vowels. The number of vowels are going to represent the number of negative charge that you have in your polyatomic ion. So if we look back at Nic as an example, we know it starts with nitrogen, it has 3 oxygens, and then since it only has 1 vowel, it's going to have a -1 charge. And then before we practice doing these polyatomic ions, I just want you to notice that the word 8 is in this sentence. The reason it's in this sentence is to remind you that all of these polyatomic ions that we're about to name and form are going to end in ATE. So let's form our polyatomic ions. So the first one we've done already is Nic. We know it's going to start with nitrogen. It's going to have 3 oxygens, and it's going to have a -1 charge, and this would be nitrate. With camel, we know it's going to start with C. It's going to have 3 oxygens because it has 3 consonants, and then it's going to have a -2 charge because it has 2 vowels, and this is going to be carbonate. Then with clam, we know it's going to start with chlorine. It has 3 consonants, so it's going to have 3 oxygens, and then it has 1 vowel, so it's going to have a -1 charge, and this will be chlorate. Then we have supper. It's going to start with sulfur. It has 4 consonants, so it's going to have 4 oxygen atoms, and then it has 2 vowels, so it's going to have a -2 charge, and this will be sulfate. Then we have phoenix. Phoenix starts with phosphorus. It's going to have phosphorus as the first element. It has 4 oxygen atoms because it has 4 consonants. And then since it has 3 vowels, it's going to have a -3 charge, and this is phosphate. And then finally we have brad. Brad is going to start with bromine. It has 3 consonants. It's going to have 3 oxygens, and it only has 1 vowel, so it's going to have a -1 charge. And this is bromate. So from this little sentence, we now can easily get 6 of the common polyatomic ions used on the AP Chemistry exam. Now, when you were learning about naming polyatomic ions, you probably learned that when you went from 8 to ite, you're going to have 1 less oxygen in your polyatomic ion. So if we look at the 4 that actually have an ite version of the polyatomic ion, like nitrate, chlorate, sulfate, and phosphate, all you would do is remove 1 of the oxygens, and then you have your new polyatomic ion. And the last addition I want to make to Nic the Camel is going to be with polyatomics that have the word hydrogen in front of it. If you ever have something like hydrogen carbonate or hydrogen phosphate, all that's going to do is remove 1 of the negative charges, or essentially add a positive charge, which is the hydrogen. So we know carbonate is CO3 2-, so if we had hydrogen carbonate, it would be HCO3-. And similarly with hydrogen phosphate, we know phosphate is PO4 3-. Hydrogen phosphate would be HPO4 2-. The last part of this video is going to be going over the 7 strong acids and the 8 strong bases that I have my students memorize for the AP Chemistry exam. Now, when you're talking about a strong acid or a strong base, what that means is that it's going to completely dissociate into solution. So when you have, for example, HCl dissolve in water, you're going to have a complete dissociation of H+ ions from Cl- ions. So let's start with the strong bases. So the strong bases are pretty simple. They're going to make a lowercase b on your periodic table. Then once you identify those 8 elements that are going to be in your strong bases, you just add your hydroxides. So obviously, since our group 1 metals are going to assume a +1 charge, you're only going to need 1 hydroxide to balance that out. So for example, if you have lithium, lithium assumes a +1 charge, so you only need 1 hydroxide to balance that out. So one of your strong bases would be lithium hydroxide or LiOH. Now for your group 2 metals, those are going to assume a positive 2 charge, which means you're going to need 2 hydroxides to balance out the charge. So if we have calcium, for example, we would need 2 hydroxides to balance that out. So calcium hydroxide is one of your strong bases, and it would be CaOH2. Next, we're going to talk about these 7 strong acids. So for acids, there are 3 strong binary acids, which means they're composed of hydrogen and 1 element. My students like to say chlorine to remember these 3, so they are going to be chlorine, bromine, and iodine. Since they are all halogens and assume a -1 charge, they would only need 1 hydrogen to balance out the charge. So this would be HCl, HBr, and HI. And beyond the 3 binary acids, there are also 4 strong acids formed with hydrogen and a polyatomic ion. To remember this, me and my students say clo, no, so, 3-4, 3-4. And the reason we say that is it kind of outlines how to form the 4 strong acids. So again, clo, no, so, 3, 4, 3, 4. And then from there you would add your hydrogens. The first 3 polyatomic ions have a negative charge. So they would only need 1 hydrogen in front of them. But sulfate has a -2 charge, so you would need 2 hydrogens for sulfuric acid. I hope this video helped you with memorizing your diatomic elements, polyatomic ions, and strong acids and bases for chemistry. If you have any questions or want me to make any more videos, please comment below and I'm happy to make them for you. I hope you have a great day and thank you for learning with me.